At this point, I want to speak to you briefly about what's going on with the JavaScript and the jQuery information that we're going to be using in this particular example. So in order for us to really understand that, let's briefly, once again, and again, I want to just show you where this is coming from. Initially, there are two JavaScript files that we're going to be working with, as well as the jQuery basic file, and that is the Ariel Flessler jQuery scroll to, as well as Trevor Davis's one-page navigation plugin. So they both kind of work together, and Davis is taken from Flessler and built upon that. And that's the beauty of working with jQuery. It's open source, and anybody can sort of work with that as long as we share it with the rest of the world. That's a beautiful thing. So let's go back to your editor for a second, and let me just point out a couple of things. First and foremost, since the one-page scroller is based on the scroll to method, we should understand what's going on with the scroll to. And as you can see here, it's really one of the simplest things that you can do. Just by plugging in this particular line right here, script source, well, I'm giving you the jQuery scroll2.js. You could download it, or you could even point to one that's online, but in this case you're working with one that's built in and it's right here. So I'll show you how we can implement that. Now, how does that actually work? Well, let's see. Within the navigation structure, we actually are going to be working with specific hrefs, and as you can see here, these links are actually not jumping to another page in our root folder directory or jumping to an external HTML page. It's actually jumping to, well, an anchor. And as you can see here, the specific one that we're looking for is the one that's called section 1, and then section 2, 3, 4, and 5. We'll get to this class in a second. So what does that mean? That means any of the areas that you have defined with an ID called, in this case, section 2, when you click on the appropriate section 2 here, you're going to be jumping and, in this case, scrolling to this particular area here, this one here. Now, how does that all work and what's going on? Well, that's the beauty of what we've got happening right here. And as you can see, this is just a minimized version, which is kind of difficult to sort of go through. So if you want to get into the basics of how this actually works and what it's doing, that's why I've pointed you to the original source for this, right? So it's the Flessler files, and it can specify a little bit more easily for you how this actually works and what the plugin actually does. So that's basically how it's concentrating on what to do and how to implement just that. Now, there's also another feature that we've seen. Let me just jump to it here again. And if you remember, the other feature was not only scrolling to a specific area, and that's part of the scroll too, but in the one-page nav JavaScript, there is also information here which, again, as I mentioned, when the area that, or the section that we want to highlight comes into view, the first thing that will happen is the button on this side is given a class to make it look like it's highlighted, or red in this case, or orange rather in this case. And as I scroll through this, there you go, WordPress, right? So as I'm scrolling up, you can see those things changing. So where is that coming from? That is actually coming from the jQuery nav file. Here I've just attached the min file, but you may remember that I mentioned to you that in the progress folder we actually have JavaScript as well, and there are two versions. There's the nav.js and the nav.min.js. Now I'm going to give you just a brief rundown of what's happening in the nav.js. Essentially, as you can see as I'm scrolling down to the actual function, essentially what's going on is we're going to be removing a specific class and appending that class to the other elements in our nav. For example, let me show you what I mean. Here in our nav, and it's just our file called nav, in our nav we have a class called current. None of the other ones have a class called current. None of these LIs do. But what the jQuery nav.js file is going to do for us is determine where this particular item is, and when it comes into the appropriate view, what it's then going to do is remove the class of current from the first list item and add the class of current to all of the other list items when they come into view. And that's a really nice little bit of code, and it's a very useful one as well. Even if you weren't using a one-page scroller, you would still probably want to implement that sort of paradigm to your structure, so that when you went to another page, you'd probably be highlighting that page to give somebody an indication of where they actually are. In this case, however, because we're all on the same page, it's a nice little bit of JavaScript here in jQuery Nav that's doing all of that hard work for us, and it's doing it dynamically. It's really beautiful. So the only thing that you really need to do after that is to actually enable it. So I'm going to do this. I'm going to remove the HTML comments, and you can see in Dreamweaver it's turning red, but whatever browser you're using, same thing might be happening. We are attaching the basic jQuery, the jQuery scroll to code, and in this case the jQuery nav. There are two of them. One is minimized, one is not. The minimized one is supposed to be faster to download. It's up to you to decide which one you want to have. Now, other than that, I've got another script tag here, open and closed, and this is all you need to do to make the nav work. One thing I do want to point out to you, in the basic structure that Davis has created, the nav is working with a div that has an ID called nav. And that's more than likely because this was done in 2010, and 2010 is pretty recent, but nevertheless, probably didn't keep in mind the idea that HTML5 has its own nav tag. So the one change that I've made in this structure is, since we are not using a div with an ID called nav, I'm not putting those hash marks before nav. So I've removed them. And the only thing we need to do is to implement this simple little line of code, and by doing so, you're going to say anything in the tag called nav will now have the one-page method attached to it. One-page nav method. So that means whatever has a class of current is going to be removed and positioned on the other ones here dynamically. And that's the basis of how the JavaScript and the jQuery works for this example. Now come back in the next video and I'll show you a little bit more about how the CSS works and how we can get this thing to stay where it is while all the other stuff is scrolling through it.